Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Alyssa Watson.
I'm Dr. Katie Berlin.
And I'm Dr. Beth Molleson.
Thank you so much for joining us in the Veterinary Breakroom. These are short conversations where the three of us get together and we like to chat informally about things that are going on in veterinary medicine. And today we're diving into whether we think virtual learning is effective for veterinary students and in what capacity. And the thing that really sparked this discussion is there was a recent directive from the AVMA Council on Education, or the COE, and the COE is who provides accreditation to different veterinary schools. And this new directive is limiting the amount of distance learning. So that's virtual education. And that can look like a lot of different things. And we'll be talking about that a little bit in the podcast about what different distance learning looks like. But this directive is limiting the amount of distance learning for veterinary students at the schools that are accredited by the COE to 15% or less. So we know that schools have a lot of freedom to substitute distance learning for in-person classes. That happened during COVID. And now I think the AVMA Council on Education is coming back and looking at that. And they are giving some more specific guidelines now, especially that people are back in the classroom. So this was really interesting to me. I actually kind of got in touch with a few of my professors from 20 plus years ago to get their take on some of this because it's been so long since I've been in the classroom. And I found out that at least at Iowa State University, one of the things that's very, very different now is all of their lectures are recorded and the students can view them later. And so that was really interesting to me because I found out that it's kind of decreased attendance a little bit in class. And the other thing that they had concerns about were not only are the veterinary students watching these later, but because they're recorded, you can speed them up and watch them at like 1.5 or 2 times the speed, which I didn't even think of doing. But I can see how, while that would be faster, I'm not sure that I think that you can get the same amount of education from that. What do you both think about doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this whole topic is interesting because, this is sort of new territory, I believe, and wouldn't call myself a complete expert on this, but I believe that it was in the fall that this department was tasked with setting these guidelines on distance education. And so from my understanding, they sent out sort of a vast survey of people involved in education at different veterinary schools and institutions to gauge what their assessment is of distance education and how it's working. Again, like you said, Alyssa, kind of in this post-COVID era, which we know is when there was a really big boom of all this distance education. And so that's kind of the part that fascinated me, is it seems like this decision was based on feedback that they got from these survey results. So I would love to see like what it is that these professors or, people in the academic environment said about distance education. Obviously, we can give the perspective of former students, and like Alyssa interviewed, someone that is currently teaching. My perspective, and I guess just my first reaction, is how different things really are than when I graduated 14 years ago. Of course, it feels like yesterday, but when I say it out loud, I guess it's not that crazy that things have changed in 14 years. But I think there are so many factors that play into this. I think we're in a very different climate now where there are increasing number of vet schools, increasing demands for professors, teachers, and there are some areas where that just isn't possible. So I think that's one thing to factor in addition to, what's best for the students, what's best for their learning. Some of the things I have heard from my friends that work in academia is just that it really has changed sort of what you are getting out of your education. So the reports I've heard from my friend that I talked to was that a lot of these students that are succeeding, he said, are the ones that would succeed no matter what. Sort of if you gave them a textbook and said, go to it for 4 years, they would succeed. But that you can actually check and see, who has watched my lectures, who hasn't, and that it's really a staggering statistic on people that don't even engage in the distance education. So, I have to imagine that when they came up with these guidelines, maybe they were getting a lot of feedback like that from professors on just sort of raising the alarm bells. But that's kind of my initial reaction. Katie, I'm curious I know you've looked into this topic too, to kind of see what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I think that's really key what you just said. I do think that students who are really highly motivated can learn anyway. And a lot of vet students are like that. We all got here because we're kind of like that. So there are a lot of people who will get a very effective education if you put the material in front of them and just tell them what, okay, you have to learn this, and they'll learn it. And they're not the ones, I think, that we're all sort of talking about. And two, I have talked with a bunch of vet students recently, in working for Instinct. And, I remember hearing from one vet student who's a very high achiever, like super high achiever, and very like business minded, and sort of veterinary community as a whole is interesting to them. And they said that they never go to class. They just watch the recordings. And I wonder, and that is a person who will succeed no matter what, for sure. But I also wonder what they're missing out on in the sense of community at school. Like, I remember spending most of my time in lecture for the first couple years, and lectures and labs, and it felt very much like we were all in this together. And I don't think I would have had the same sense of belonging there if I hadn't had that, because I wasn't super social in vet school. Like, I studied a lot. I was a homebody. I had like a couple of close friends. And so to me, like, the social community aspect of it is important. Just showing up and sitting in your seat, we all sat in the same seat in the lecture hall, like for 4 years or whatever. And just like going through the process together, and laughing about the professors that always like use these funny expressions, that I still repeat, that I might not even have absorbed if I was watching them alone in my apartment at, 1.5 speed.
Yep.
But also, like, I know myself, I don't learn very effectively this way. I think I do. And then my retention is not good. And like, I can't even listen to audiobooks sped up. So I don't know how anybody does that. Like, I can't remember what's going on. I don't pay attention. So so that alone would be strange for me. But like, I remember skipping class a couple of times. I'm going to just confess it out loud. It was virology.
Oh,
and
that seems reasonable.
Yeah, our professor was not a clinician. He was a scientist, and he basically just read off of his notes, which we all had. And so I didn't get anything out of going to class. And I felt really naughty, like staying home, because I just wasn't a class skipper. But I could just read the notes and highlight them, and it was the same. So I feel like there are certain situations where maybe in-person versus distance doesn't make much difference. But
Sure.
For the most part, I'm really glad I had all of those in-person experiences. And I'm going to sound like such a boomer saying that, but
No,
I'm glad things were the way they were when we were in school.
Katie, I very much agree. And I like that you brought that up, because everything I've read on this topic focuses solely on education and academic performance and, pass rate of the NAVLE and all of that. But to me, when I think of the changes that have taken place in the last 14 years, like it really does devastate me a little bit, because that social aspect of vet school is 100% what got me through. I think especially, of course, when we talk about mental health challenges in the field and how profound those are, and, how difficult of a profession this is, and how many times I have to phone a friend or a classmate to get through the clinic day. This, I think, has so many more profound effects than just is our school NAVLE rate going to drop or is it not? I also think about that from the professor standpoint of, if they love teaching and feed off of the students. What does this do to them? Also, the professor I talked to said one of the big challenges is with a lot of this distance learning, it's almost like a learn at your own pace. So when he's giving lectures, he really doesn't know exactly where the students are at, what they've comprehended. Same thing, just, I mean, I'm sure you guys can relate, but like the study groups that I would do after school, we'd go in the study room. You knew that everyone you were with had just absorbed the exact same information. You were on the same page. You could discuss things with each other, ask questions. You had the same level of stress because you sat through the same lectures that day. Just all of those in-person things that bond you together. I just can't imagine how much I would feel like I was on an island if I was just left to do this curriculum at my own pace. And, hopefully I would have fallen into the category that could succeed based on sheer will, but I worry I would have fallen into the category that's procrastinating and never catching up and never even opening those distance learnings, before the test. And it's just scary to think about.
If you've noticed your dog having difficulty moving, jumping, or playing, it could be a sign of osteoarthritis pain, or OA pain. OA pain is a chronic condition that impacts how your dog moves and feels. Do you think your dog is showing signs of OA pain? Know that treatment options are available. Ask your vet about what they can do to help control your dog's OA pain. Tap Learn More for details.
The sense of community that I had in vet school was something that I cherish, have cherished my entire career. We had the most wonderful class. We had 100 students. We're all still really close. Like, we have a Facebook group. And within that group, there was a core of maybe 4 or 5 of us that were just like that, what you're talking about, where we studied together in the evenings, on weekends, prepared for tests together. And we still have that bond. One of them actually came, my really good friend, Dr. Costello, came to WVC this past spring. And it was the same thing. We were like, what lectures are we going to? We sat in the same spot that we always sat when we were in class. We're in the back on the right. And we knew that that's where we were going to be. And so physically going to class is something that I do think has value. At the same time, I feel a little bit hypocritical because I just renewed my license, and we have gone back after COVID to requiring in-person hours. During COVID, that requirement was dropped. And I do feel a little hypocritical because I'm like, why do I have to go to in-person? I can do a webinar, I can do this. And is it really truly different, with those continuing on of your education versus that first, exposure to all of these topics? And I think maybe it could be building again on what you said too, Beth, not just for the student, but like you said, for the educator. And I think it could be just like students, just like we said, there are students that learn differently. There are some students that learn really well with a textbook, or some students that learn, really well visually, or they want to ask questions or things like that. I think different educators probably have different strengths, where some of them could do really well with distance learning if they really like to do things like make polls and make, interactive tools, which can now be inserted into these types of lectures. Then that's really wonderful. But I don't know how many educators have the time or the bandwidth to do that. And so that's another place where I was wondering how it affected, like you said, Beth, how did it affect the educators? Are they not feeling as fulfilled or effective when they're teaching this way?
I just wanted to comment on one thing you said, Alyssa, which is, you were saying like you feel a little bit hypocritical because you would rather like get your CE through webinars because, why do you have to go to an in-person lecture? And I do think it's different. And I don't necessarily think it's different because of the material. I think it's because when we're in vet school, the majority of vet students, even if they're working, are working either at the vet school or around the vet school. And so it is their job to go to school and learn. And it's sort of a time commitment that we know is sort of all encompassing for most people. And it's not historically a career like law school or business school where people will do it part-time while they're doing other stuff. It's just hasn't historically been that way. Whereas when we're all out and we're busy professionals, time off means we're not earning income, where it's costing a lot of money to go to conferences. We're more likely to have families and partners depending on us, and outside pressures where like getting veterinary education is not our job anymore. I mean, it's part of our job, but it's not our sole responsibility. And so I do think it's different. I also don't learn as much from webinars as I do when I go to conferences. Like, I think that's true. I can go back to the webinar though, and that's important. But I do feel like if distance learning became more a part of veterinary education, like I wonder if we would see that change a little bit, where people would go to vet school part-time, where they would be able to do this like another type of graduate degree where they don't have to completely quit the rest of their life to do this. And I don't know what that would do to veterinary education in general, or the caliber of veterinarians, who come out of school. I just really don't know that, but it's interesting to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this topic is so tricky because there are so many different pros and cons. I mean, I think from my perspective, and I know you guys share a lot of the same opinions, we've talked a lot about the cons, but I think there certainly are some pros like you got into, Katie, just thinking of like people in my class who had kids, or like you said, this could change, open up vet school to a whole new demographic of people. Might that be a benefit? People who are recovering from injuries. I mean, it's endless. It's kind of like the whole debate we have about going back into the office, all of that virtual versus in-person conversation. And then I think when we start to go toward pros, I also think of necessities. Like I mentioned at the beginning, are we in a privileged enough spot in this industry where we can really debate pros and cons and choose what we think is better? Or are we in a spot where we have to say distance education may be the only path forward to produce the number of veterinarians needed? And, certainly we need to figure out what that's going to do to NAVLE scores and caliber of graduating veterinarians and all of that stuff. But that's sort of the spot I land, where sure, in a ideal world, we'd have, professors galore and engaged students, everyone clamoring for the front row and in-person classes. But is that reality? I'm not so sure.
Yeah, and it brings up another really important topic, and that's financially, because there definitely are some benefits, financial benefits, for having the distance education. As you said, Katie, you can have experts and clinical professors all over the world teaching classes and have access to that. But also, I do remain, maybe I'm just a little jaded or just a little skeptical, but I do remain a little bit concerned as to whether or not those cost savings will actually get passed on to students. Because if they're not getting passed on to students and they're just a way for these universities to make more money, then I don't think that that's a great use of, or a great reason to turn to distance education.
So what about the COE's number that they decided upon? So the directive is, 15% or less, right? Has to be distance learning. And, I think at some schools, it's like at some universities and colleges, not just veterinary, it's like 75% right now. And so I am curious to know what your colleagues said about that.
Yeah. So first of all, I thought it was a little confusing because it did say the 15%. So limiting distance education to 15% of the preclinical curriculum. And I guess we should have said that out from the outset. We're talking about, all of our ologies, cardiology, ophthalmology, virology, parasitology and our core basics. We're not talking about clinics, which is a whole, obviously you need to be in person for clinics. But 15% of the preclinical curriculum, but then they also said this 50% of direct instruction delivered in person. And so I'm not sure if that's what they're referring to with that, where universities like State are doing right now, where they're recording and allowing people to rewatch later. Maybe that's what they mean, that they can't, that 50% of that, you have to show up and be there. You can't watch it later. Reserving those recorded sessions for, just like you were talking about, Beth, maybe times that you have to be out because you're ill or your child is ill or something like that. But at least 50% of the time you need to be in the classroom. So I'm actually hopeful that there's going to be some clarification on that, and we'll link it in the comments, but the AVMA is actually doing, an online question and answer on this. As to, what this directive really means. So I was a little bit confused by it. I don't know. Beth,
Yeah.
Do you have any other insight?
I think, I mean, unfortunately, I am not an expert on this. I do wonder how they reach that percentage, and I wonder how feasible it is. When I hear 15%, to me, that sounds like a drastic leap from what a lot of schools are doing right now. And so, of course, to me, that's always a big concern whenever you're trying to make a huge change like that. It's like, what is compliance going to be? What loopholes are universities going to come up with? What sort of enforcement, who's enforcing this? Is it, oh, well, for this course, there's a professor who keeps office hours from 9 to 5. So that, I'm just imagining all the potential loopholes and how universities may try to get around this, whether or not they may just not have the resources to meet this 15% right out of the gate. And so I have a feeling I'm excited to try to attend that Q&A session, because I think it'll illuminate more of the hurdles that the people who are having to execute this are going to face. I don't have enough insight into that, but yeah, that was my first reaction to that 15%, is just like, wow, that feels almost back to pre-COVID levels, and how things have changed. I just can't imagine universities are set up to make a huge change like that.
I'm sure they'll have a time period during which they're allowed to make those changes. So it'll go into effect at a certain time. But yeah, I am curious to know what comes to light during the Q&A. And, I think it's safe to say that regardless of feelings about the AVMA and whether they truly represent the profession, because I know there's a lot of chatter about that online all the time, I do think that the COE is establishing this directive because they really feel it's the best thing for the profession. Whether or not you agree with that is another story. And I'm sure that there are very strong opinions on both sides at all levels of veterinary medicine. But I do, I do want to mention that I read that there's a way to petition the AVMA. So like schools can petition the COE to offer more than 15% of their curriculum as distance learning. So it does look like there are avenues to maybe making exceptions for that directive, but I don't know what the criteria are going to be where the COE determines whether that's acceptable or not. Like there's a hybrid vet school actually opening. Hanover is going to be a hybrid program where a lot of their curriculum is going to be online and virtual. So what's that going to look like, in the face of this? So there's a lot of questions. But I think we all kind of knew that at some point the COVID changes were not going to be forever, just like our CE requirements are changing in a lot of states. And we're seeing that now with schools. And I think it would be great if we could chat with some vet students who I'm sure have strong feelings about this and see what they're thinking.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I would love to. We're always interested in hearing everybody's opinion. So
yeah,
drop us a line.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that brings us to win of the week, right, guys? And I already kind of mentioned mine. I got all of my documentation together. It took me 2 hours to renew my license this past week. because I had to go find all my certificates, because now it's back in person too. And now with renewing, you used to just put your hours in, and then once in a while you'd get audited. I think I've gotten audited a couple times in my 20-year career, but now you can actually upload like your certificates and proof of attendance and everything. So, which was cool, but also a lot more time consuming.
Yeah, it's like doing your
taxes. I didn't realize I had to put all that together. But I got it done. And I actually started a new folder on my computer that everything's going to go into from now on. So the next time I do it, I'll be all ready.
My gosh, I will be very impressed if you show us next year your folder that is complete. I feel like every year. Yeah.
Every year. Like 2 months and then.
Yeah. That's how mine
I have
be,
faith.
So.
Yeah, we don't have to show it, only if you're audited. So you just like check a box that says you've completed the requisite hours, and that's it. But then if you get audited, you need all the stuff for much longer, I think, than 2 years. So yeah, but I'm definitely not organized enough with that. But yeah, my win of the week is that it's spring here. And one of my favorite things about having moved to Denver is there's live music all the time. And a lot of it's outside. So I have lots of fun concerts coming up, and live music is one of my favorite things. So I'm very, very excited. And it just feels like spring is for real now, because looking forward to my first trip to Red Rocks and all that fun stuff. So it's a big win for me. How about you, Beth?
I can relate to that, Katie. Spring is my favorite season because it fills me with so much hope.
Yeah.
Yeah, 72 and sunny here today, so no complaints. My win, I guess, is somewhat related to the sunshine. It's a PSA/win of the week. I went to the dermatologist yesterday, got my all clear on my skin check. So it's a reminder, everyone out there, make those appointments, make time for yourself. Yeah, for especially anyone that grew up in the tanning bed generation, gotta get to the dermatologist.
Yes, that's a
win.
good PSA.
Yes.
Especially when you're pale like us.
Yeah. That's my dermatologist. Yeah, called me out on my skin tone, which is I was like, you should be pleased at how pale I am. So
that's right.
Anyway,
I always feel guilty when I go and have tan lines. I'm like, I'm sorry, I run. I can't keep sunscreen on.
Yeah, probably good that I
put it on
spring. Right. Anyway, thank you all for joining us here in the break room. We will catch you all next time.
Thanks for joining us in the Veterinary Break Room. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, including a video version on YouTube. While you're there, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review us. You can also listen to or watch our podcast episodes on our website at cliniciansbrief.com/podcasts, or drop us a line at podcasts@vetmedics.com. Veterinary Break Room is a VetMedics production produced by Alexis Ussery and co-hosted by me, Dr. Alyssa Watson, and Dr. Beth Molleson.